Isha, do you have any questions for me?
How should I phrase this? Like your experience coming from I don't know if it could be classified as an insular community, and the other communities that have spoken here, Muslim, Amish, Orthodox. How would you tie those two kinds of experiences together? Because are people trying to leave the community that aren't able to? Is there some way that there is a connection between these different kinds of communities?
So we are not insular, but it does feel like that at times. It does feel like we are trapped in our own communities, and I didn't have much time to talk about myself because I wanted to discuss a little bit about the boarding school and the high increased rates of violence against Native women. But one of the reasons why I applied for my internship with Torah was I grew up traditionally. I was sent to my grandparents' place on the weekends and the summers, and they lived for a while without running water or electricity. So we had that kind of commonality of, really, really appreciating hot showers. Just stuff like that. But in terms of reservation life, I wanted to leave desperately. I myself was about to kill myself. I attempted suicide probably about 3 times. And thankfully, I didn't have the courage to follow through with it. But at that time, I felt that I was trapped within my community. In my community, there's a lot of alcoholism. There's a high rate of depression. And within my own school year before I left, one of my closest cousins killed himself. He was 12 years old. For every suicide in the United States, 1 in 4 is a Native American.
So if people wanted to leave the reservation and integrate more in the outside world, is there resistance? Is there effort to keep them from doing that?
Not in the same way as from what our other presenters have described, but it can be very difficult, especially culture shock. I grew up where everyone was Navajo, but then when I went to a boarding school in the East Coast, I was suddenly surrounded by, for lack of a better word, white people, and that was very, very scary. And often in border towns are towns that aren't on the reservation, but really come up close to it. There are very high rates of racism and physical assault against Native American individuals. I remember in Farmington, New Mexico, one of the border towns that border my reservation, mentally handicapped Navajo was kidnapped and violently beaten and was branded with a swastika on his forehead. So there isn't so much an effort to keep people in, but it does feel like you're trapped in that community. And it does feel like there are very few options for you to leave. But there's no real thing, like no physical force keeping you in. Yes?
Hi Brian, thank you so much. I don't really have words. The tragedy is epic. And I just want to say that I'm just so glad you're still with us, because your voice is beautiful and strong and resilient, and we really need you. I wondered if you're working on a project. I loved what you said about storytelling as medicine. I'm a theater person, and so I really believe that as well. I'm a survivor. What is your next project? What are you creatively dreaming about, or is there something you'd want to share with us in that regard?
Sure. Well, a little bit more about my storytelling roots. When I was with my grandparents, they didn't have electricity, so in order to occupy young 6-year-old Brian's mind, they would tell me the traditional stories. So I grew up hearing a lot of my creation myths, a lot of what we call the warrior twin stories. So at a very young age, I was instilled with the knowledge that storytelling is part of who I am, and I am trying to keep that going with my storytelling. Right now, I am writing a book, and the quickest way to sum it up is think Harry Potter meets Navajo mythology. But I also do a lot of filmmaking, a lot of animation. A lot of my stories are geared towards younger individuals between 8 and 12, because that was a very formative time of me when I was looking for representations of me and was not finding any.
Thank you so much for being here and for talking openly and presenting. Just astounded at all the intersectional things that are happening today. I kind of have a similar question that I want to piggyback off of and ask. So a number of these covenantal or insular communities have self-insularized, if that's even a word, in response to persecution and trauma, like the Orthodox Jewish community, like my understanding from Amish communities as well, immigrant communities, things like that. And it seems to me the Native experience is different in terms of how reservations have been established. And I'm curious if you have any reflections on the contrast there actually about, I guess, some level of self-enclosure and when it's self-instituted versus externally instituted, and how that just might play out differently.
Definitely. I did actually, just like yesterday, I had to make some adjustments to my speech because of how mind-blowing a lot of the presenters were. I think what we all have in common is that we think that our cultures are stagnant, that our beliefs don't have room for growth, that they should be sustained as they are. And especially in my community, we are losing some of our ceremonies, and in 2005, my language was on the endangered list of becoming extinct. So there was a drive to kind of preserve the culture as it was then, in the same way that you would record the biblical stories and have a hard copy of it, and that's going to be the one only way of it, and it's not going to ever change. But cultures change, cultures evolve, cultures grow, and Leslie Marmon Silko in her book Ceremony said, the only things that don't change are dead. And if you really consider like pop culture, it's constantly changing. There are new icons coming and going. That's how I believe culture and beliefs should also be. They should be changing, they should be growing, they shouldn't be confined into one specific way, because then how do you address the advent of technology, of internets? Because that's going to be a huge thing.
Hi, I have so many questions,
Oh yeah, bring it on.
but I did pick like the one. But I just love what you just said at the end there too, the culture that's not changing is dead. I mean, that's definitely true for languages, and a lot of linguists will tell you that. And that's absolutely true for cultures, and I wish more people understood that a culture is like a living being, and that's the beauty of it. But I really like what you said about self-representation. And I've heard a lot about representation, but self-representation is a very different concept, and it's interesting. But you come from a small community, a minority community, and lately it's been interesting to me to see minority filmmakers and actors and directors get a chance at a project, and then they create something beautiful and wonderful, and then some parts of that same community say, well, that doesn't represent me, or it is not, wholly encompassing like the authentic experience of what it's like to be whatever, and I'm thinking directly of like Kumail Nanjiani's movie about him meeting his wife. He's a Pakistani actor, and in any case, and then he got a lot of that criticism. And I'm wondering, do you feel that burden because you come from a very underrepresented community to represent in your art, everything? Is that even possible? How do you reconcile them? What are your thoughts on like an authentic experience represented?
I really don't think that there is such a thing as an authentic experience that is going to encapsulate an entire culture. I think that's wrong. I think that people that profess that are self-absorbed, and you shouldn't take them seriously. Because just like with Torah and all the other speakers, their experiences are so unique that it can't speak for everyone. I cannot speak for all Native Americans. I can't speak for all 560 federally recognized tribes. I can't speak for all 500,000 Navajos because my experience is very, very unique. I left my reservation to go to boarding school when I was 15. Any art that I produce, I know is not going to fully cover everyone's ground, and it's not my responsibility to cover everyone's ground. My responsibility is to tell the best damn story I can tell. If it was a documentary, then maybe. But for the world of fiction, if you come across anyone who says this is the authentic experience, again, that story is not going to change. Like once it's set in stone, once it's printed, it's never going to change again. So it's already dying.
Okay. And I guess, is there time? Yeah. I'll do one more, which is that I have a few filmmaker friends, and they're very like socially conscious people, and they want to represent minority culture. So this question is kind of on behalf of things that I know that they are thinking about. And they worry about the lack of representation in their work. They worry about not finding enough actors or talent from even backstage to be able to fill that need. And then what happens sometimes due to logistical constraints, and sometimes because people just don't care, that people get shoehorned into just a position that's a very visible role so that the project can say, we're represented and we have, some minorities on board. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how to prevent something like that from occurring where, might be members of underrepresented groups, particularly in the filmmaking industry, are just at this visible end and then maybe not anywhere else. But, what can we do to prevent that process if it's, worth preventing?
I think there are two ways, but I completely understand what you mean. Does everyone remember that commercial of the Indian crying in the river? Iron Eyes Cody? He's not native. He was Italian. He was an Italian immigrant, widely known. So in Native American communities, there is that issue of people claiming Native heritage, but actually not being Native themselves. So a lot of times, especially when it comes to like applying for funding for support, even if they have like a Native name, they'll say that they're Native descent, so that way they can get that funding and do whatever they want with it. With regards to your specific question of how to address that, I think in terms of that, there are two ways. One is by going the Hollywood route, working so that way you are just a filmmaker, not just a minority filmmaker, and making your mark there, saying that as just a regular filmmaker who happens to be Navajo, I'm succeeding at this level. Another option is to produce your own stuff and distribute your own stuff, and especially in today's society where YouTube is a viable market for distribution, that is much easier than it's ever been. Either way, they're not going to be easy avenues.
I was referring more to non-natives, like non-minorities, like mostly people from white backgrounds who want to include minorities, but I can see how it's difficult for them, and I can see, but at the same time, you don't want to discourage them from not trying. So, I was wondering if you had any advice of how to do that without shoehorning people.
So just to reiterate the question, are you asking about incorporating more diverse people into projects, and how to scout for that, or
how to prevent, I think what ends up happening, and this happens a little bit in my field, and it's different, but when we set up events sometimes, and I work with the broader secular community, I'll find that in the end, people are panicking because they'll be like, okay, well, there's not enough people of color at the stage here, and so they'll just pull in random people just to have some color, and it's just tokenism, just empty tokenism, and I've seen it, firsthand I've seen it, and it's of course horrible, and I've heard similar stories that this happens, or sometimes people are pressured to have this happen in the filmmaking industry, particularly since it's such a visible media. So, I mean, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that but if it's a vague question, that's fine. Like, you don't have to answer.
I actually myself have been shoehorned into a few roles myself just because of my native heritage, and I definitely have benefited from it. I've been in a few small roles. On the one hand, it does feel cheap, it feels like you're selling out. But on the other hand, it is a means of establishing your platform, as a means of gaining traction. Like, I view it as kind of a stepping stone, a necessary evil. I actually did a paper about playing into stereotypes in order to promote your career and how that can feel as someone who isn't Plains, having to dress up like a Plains Indian for a role. So it can be tough, but I think at least in the current structure of film industry, you can either milk it or you can use it as a launching pad. Don't get rid of them. That's what I'm saying. Don't get rid of those roles because someone can benefit from it. There can be good that can be from those roles.
Could you tell us more about boarding school? What we had thought.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I just glossed over that. So I'll talk a little bit about mine, kind of shoehorn back into the boarding schools. I was fortunate enough to go to the Hotchkiss School on the East Coast in Lakeville, Connecticut. It is one of the most prestigious high schools in the nation. I believe tuition there was like $40,000 when I went there. I did my sophomore, junior, and senior year there, and I was fortunate enough to have a full-ride scholarship. A crazy experience. I went from being surrounded by Navajos to being one of two. My grandmother visited me during Parents' Weekend one weekend, and my mom said that she was anxious. She was bitter the entire time, yelling at her. So she told me to be patient with my grandma. But when we finally were able to kind of get away from the school, we went to a local restaurant to have pizza. I remember very, very clearly that it was pizza. And my grandma, she grabbed my hand and she was crying. And she told me, she asked me, are they hurting you? Are they touching you? And it was at that time that I didn't really fully realize like what I'd done to her or to my community by leaving. And it wasn't until later, after I graduated, I told her, no, they're treating me very well. I'm happier here than I was on the reservation. But later on, I was talking with my aunt, and she told me that my grandma was part of the boarding school traumas. When she was a young girl, she went out herding sheep one day, and then the United States government kidnapped her. Her family at the time thought she died because she just left without a trace. They thought she fell off into a river, something happened to her, and then they just moved on. But 4 or 5 years later, my grandma returned. She has not spoken a single word about that experience ever since then. Every time I try to bring that up with her, Grandma, do you want to talk about that? Like, what happened to you? And she immediately just changes the subject. And I think the only time that I saw her kind of be honest with her experience about that was when she was at the boarding school with me and just crying, asking if I had been touched in a sexual way. Yeah, again, there is no hard data because all the data that has been collected about boarding schools was to promote the success rates of assimilation. And I think that's very, very telling of all the data that has been collected on Native Americans at that time is that it's very skewed data. It's very romanticized about how we were dying. And it's very hard to get any actual information out of these old documents because of that skewed perspective that the researchers had. Yes, sir.
Piggybacking on what Sarah was saying, can you give us any concrete suggestions for how people outside the community can actually contribute and help the community? Are there any organizations that people can get involved with, any organizations? And related to that, is there any example that you could think of that you feel like outsiders in your community misunderstand or misrepresent that you'd like us to have a better appreciation for, that would help us better understand and better appreciate your community?
Yeah, those are 2 subjects, okay. So when you say a Native American person said this, a Native American person said that, just think about that. Just think about how if the Quaker Oats guy represented all of white America. To say that that image is representative of all white religions, all white people. And if that's the only image that you're exposed to, how is that going to view your perception of yourself? That is what we go through with Hollywood, with mascots. It is one image, a Plains Indian wearing feathers. That is not our image. It has been forced upon us. And yet, that's what everyone readily accepts. And what was your first question again? I forgot.
Are there any organizations to get involved with or any concrete suggestions people can have to really help out communities?
Kickstarter. Kickstarter and help fund any Native films, movies, theater projects. As of right now, I don't think there are any overarching. I don't think there are any outside organizations that can help us, but do support our artists. Do watch movies, do read books by us, do watch theater plays by us. Is the best concrete example I can give, because I really don't want people to say that we need to be saved. That in itself is a fallacy. We don't need saviors. We just want support. We just want our own space to tell our own stories, and we'd love for you guys to listen to it, to watch it, to read it. We don't need to be saved.